All right, everyone, so I finally got done reading this book, Kosovo Crisis, by Serbian writer Vojin Joksimovic. It took me months to finally complete it because, to be honest with you, I kept postponing it. I kept postponing the completion of this book because, to be frank, there are parts of this book that feel like a drag. There are parts of the book that feel like it's just dragging on, and it feels tedious and it feels boring. But maybe that's just a me thing. Maybe other people will read this book and find the parts that I found to be boring to be interesting and educational and informative for them. It's all really just a matter of opinion and preference. But regardless of all that, I found this book to be, for the most part, very, very interesting and informative. The book is, well, the title is quite self-explanatory. The book is about, for the most part, the Kosovo conflict that took place in the late 1990s. The book does touch upon the subjects of the conflicts that took place in Bosnia and in Croatia within the decade of the 1990s, but the main focus is Kosovo. And the book can pretty much be summed up in a matter of, a handful of points. The main enemy was the KLA. The main problem was the KLA. In the beginning, the Yugoslav government, Yugoslav forces were fighting against the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. This was a terrorist organization, an Albanian terrorist organization ran by a bunch of thugs, pimps, drug dealers, really scum of the earth, lowlives, people who needed the hard iron fist of justice. The Yugoslav government had every right to fight and destroy this organization because it was murderous and evil. In one instance, the KLA actually kidnapped a Serbian official, and they found this poor guy's body in the middle of a road somewhere. I think his eyeballs was gouged out. His body was cut up and lacerated. Pretty gruesome stuff. There were a lot of grisly murders that took place. Yes, there were times when the Serbian authorities went too far, but nonetheless, for the most part, the KLA was the KLA was the main culprit, and really in the beginning, it was the KLA that started the problems in Kosovo. It was not the Serbs. The Serbs really had no interest in causing violence and provoking or stoking up violence. The KLA was the problem. The Serbs were fighting terrorists. Yes, like in any war, there were moments where the Serbs went too far, where they were being excessive. But really, who would we prefer? Are we going to choose the KLA over the Serbs? Well, that's the mistake that NATO made. And this is one of the observations that the book makes. One of the mistakes, or I don't want to say it's a mistake because everyone in NATO knew that the KLA was no damn good. So scratch that off. It wasn't a mistake. But one of the crimes, I should say, that NATO committed was supporting the KLA, supporting a terrorist organization. It wasn't just an Islamic terrorist organization. It was a Nazi Islamic terrorist organization, because these Albanian terrorists were the very descendants who fought in the SS Skanderberg, the Albanian Nazi unit. And so one of the crimes that NATO committed was backing and supporting the KLA. Now, the book does not emphasize a lot, it really doesn't emphasize at all on the role that Germany played in this. This is something that Noam Chomsky has talked a lot about, the fact that the Germans were really probably right after the United States, the biggest supporter of Germany was right after the U.S., probably the biggest supporter of the KLA. We know for a fact that the Germans trained and armed the KLA. It's very interesting that the Germans armed and trained the SS Skanderberg during the Second World War, and then in the 1990s, it was the Germans who armed and trained the descendants of those SS Skanderberg fighters. So again, we find yet another example out of billions and billions of examples of history rhyming and repeating itself. So here was NATO supporting these terrorists in the name of democracy, in the name of fighting against the tyranny of Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic was compared to Adolf Hitler, which is a crazy very inadequate comparison. Elie Wiesel rejected this comparison. He said that it belittles the gravity of the Holocaust, and also the evil of Adolf Hitler, to just sit there and nonchalantly, willy-nilly compare Milosevic to Hitler. Milosevic was fighting a terrorist organization. He had no interest in committing genocide. But here was the United States. Here were the Germans supporting these Albanian Nazis, and they bombed the Serbs for over 70 days. I think it was a 78-day, something like that, bombing campaign, bombing the Serbs, deliberately targeting civilians, supporting the KLA. Oh, and here's another thing that NATO did. NATO pressured the Serbs, really forced the Serbs to withdraw their police force from Kosovo. And the Serbs were saying, if you remove the police force, we're screwed, because we're living amongst a bunch of Albanians who hate us. And so America supports a terrorist organization, bombs Serbia, targets civilians deliberately, and then forces the police to withdraw, the Serb police, the Yugoslav police, to withdraw from Kosovo, thus leaving the Serbian civilian population defenseless. Not just the Serbian civilian population, but also the Albanian civilian population, because there were many Albanians who didn't support the KLA, who didn't like the KLA, who were loyal citizens of Yugoslavia, who didn't mind being under Yugoslav authority, and they hated the KLA because the KLA were a bunch of thugs, pimps, lowlives, and scumbags. But there was NATO pretending to be a do-gooder, and there was Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright had this facade of being in favor for democracy, and she was going to fight the evil barbarian Serbs, when the reality is that she herself, as a little girl, was rescued by a Serbian journalist. Her father was rescued by this very Serbian journalist. Her father was Czech. He was a Czechoslovakian official. He worked for the Czechoslovakian embassy in Serbia during the Second World War when the Nazis were killing Jews. It was a Serb who rescued her father and her family. It was a Serb who rescued Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright admitted in an interview that if her father had the choice of being either a Czech or being a Serb, he would have been a Serb. He wanted to be Serbian. That's how much he loved the Serbian people, because the Serbs rescued him, saved his life. But there was Madeleine Albright defending the very people who loved Adolf Hitler, the very descendants of the Albanians who would have killed her if they had the chance. It's just absolutely sickening. And then NATO was claiming that they wanted to help the Albanian people, but actually what ended up happening was, when NATO was bombing the Serbs got extremely angry with the Albanians, because they knew that the Albanians were being, specifically the KLA, were being supported by NATO. So you had all of these examples of violence being done against Albanians by Serbs as a reaction to the NATO bombing. And there were actually more atrocities against Albanians during the NATO bombing than before the NATO bombing. So the NATO bombing was counterproductive. It didn't bring about the outcome that it wanted, or that it claimed to have wanted. And then after the bombing was over, the NATO basically gave the KLA free reign over Kosovo, and you had many, many murders. You had hundreds and hundreds of murders. You had many, many kidnappings. Hundreds of people were kidnapped and their organs were stolen, which is very, very horrific. Their organs were ripped out from their bodies. Very, very horrific stuff. And you had a lot of cases where gypsies were murdered by the KLA, Serbs were murdered, other Albanians were murdered by the KLA, and tens of thousands of Albanians actually fled to Serbia. So this whole idea that the Serbs hated Albanians, they were racist, they were Hitler, why in the hell would they accept so many thousands of Albanian refugees who were fleeing violence that was being done by the KLA? Now, another observation that I like, made by Vojislav Joksimovic, is really comparing NATO with the Third Reich. That is actually a more adequate comparison than comparing Milosevic with Adolf Hitler. Because, and this is the observation that Joksimovic makes, before Hitler invaded Poland, the Nazis were claiming that the Poles, the evil Polish nationalists, were committing atrocities on ethnic Germans and all that, and they were making things up. In fact, the Germans literally invented a false flag attack. They had German agents, German operatives, dress up with masks, pretend to be Polish terrorists, and they had them go to a German radio station that was near the Polish border, and there was a terrorist attack done by Polish nationalists, and they had to send the army, and they defeated these Poles, and then they killed these Poles. And there's a picture you can see of this dead Polish person, and the Germans are saying, "Look, we killed the terrorists," and all this. And the fact is that the Germans actually found some poor soul, I think he was an ethnic Pole, and they murdered him, and then they said, "Look, we got the terrorists," when in fact they just murdered some innocent man and then called them a terrorist. And Hitler used these news reports, these fabricated news reports, to justify the invasion of Poland. And the United States was making up things, saying, "Oh, look," they were exaggerating things about Serbian violence against Albanians, and they were saying, "Look, we have to go invade Yugoslavia," when the reality is that the reason why NATO invaded Yugoslavia was to show the world that no one should mess with NATO, no one should not conform with NATO. Basically, the whole world should submit to NATO, or else look at Yugoslavia. Do you want to end up like that? So it was all about making an example of Yugoslavia. It was also about crippling Russia's influence, because Serbia is one of Russia's biggest allies. It's definitely Russia's biggest ally in Southeastern Europe. One of probably the biggest Russian ally in Europe, actually, as a whole. And so how do we weaken Russia in Europe? We have to crush Russia's biggest ally, the Serbs. Same reason why the Austro-Hungarian Empire supported the Albanians back in the 19th century, back in the early 20th century. Why? Because the Austro-Hungarians knew if you're going to weaken Russia, you have to make sure that Russia's biggest ally in Europe, Serbia, is devastated, is crippled. So NATO was doing the same thing that the Austro-Hungarian Empire did. But there are certain moments where this is my own opinion, there are certain moments where the book feels like it's dragging on, it feels kind of boring, it feels kind of tedious. There are parts of the book where it gets repetitive. There's one part of the book where the author goes into his proposal as to what Serbia should do, his proposal as what the Serbian government should do, as if the Serbs are going to actually listen to what Joksimovic suggests, as if people are going to read this book and say, "Oh yeah, let's change our policy because we read a book." This is one thing I don't understand. Authors proposing policy in books, I just don't really get it. Like, unless you have the ear of very powerful people, I just don't see the point. It doesn't do anything but annoy the reader with very tedious paragraphs, a bunch of policies that are not really going to happen. It's just very tedious, and it's a drag, to be honest with you. And this is the kind of stuff that I just found to be very annoying. But nonetheless, if you want a detailed account of NATO's war in Yugoslavia, specifically in Kosovo, this is definitely a must read. Actually, it's very, very detailed. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.